here and also in many countries that actually women are fighting against it at the moment. As Mariam said as well, I personally, as a Kurdish woman, I find it really odd that I'm here today in the UK Parliament, one of the biggest democracies, speaking about that Sharia councils are treating women in a horrible way, or they are discriminatory, whereas it should have really not existed, let alone arguing that it should be abolished. So I think we are far behind the struggles of women back in Middle East and North Africa and elsewhere, or in Pakistan and many other places. And I just want to say that really I am here today, but I'm in full solidarity with the Kurdish women in Rojava who are up in arms against ISIS terrorists. And that especially yesterday, 2 young Kurdish women have declared that they will be leading the fight to recapture Raqqa, which is the capital of the ISIS caliphates. So this is a huge and significant development that is actually women in Rojava, in Kurdistan, who are making sure to defeat ISIS, to defeat Islamism, and to defeat this Islamic political project that wants to enslave women, to take them as sex slaves or jihadi brides, or basically sell them in slave markets. So this is a significant development in the politics of this region, that it's actually women who do not want Sharia law, who do not want Islamism, who do not want to be ruled by the divine words or whatever. So to have this discussion here and today in England and elsewhere in Europe, women from the same background here again repeating and actually continuing the same struggle that this should be abolished, I think it should have not been there in the first place. Now I just want to tell you that I grew up in a family where half of them were Muslims, religious, half secular or atheists. So but my mom would wear a white veil, but never a black burqa or a black veil, and coming out with banners to say burqa is my choice, or I want to be ruled by Sharia law. Whereas to basically now, to my horror and disbelief, Islamist jihadis who claim to represent Muslims rush to the streets and protest in front of Parliament in UK and other European countries, openly calling for imposition of Sharia law, for killing infidels, for rejecting Western democracy, and much more. We already see Sharia councils, Islamic schools, and Islamic centers in this country and elsewhere spreading hatred, fear, bigotry, and misogyny, supported through public funding in most instances. Yet it is seen as part of Muslim people's cultures and identity. Those who claim to represent the Muslim community are a small minority, in my opinion, and in no way they can represent the ethnic minorities who are extremely diverse in their cultural, religious, social, and political affiliations. For example, the Kurdish community, which forms a huge part of the ethnic population in this country and elsewhere in Europe, it does not see Islam as their sole identity. We have different religions and people who are Muslims but who live a normal life. I see Muslim men who drink. I see Muslim women who have boyfriends. And they are from Middle Eastern backgrounds, and they might even consider themselves as Muslims, but they are not fanatic burqa wearers, or they go to the street to call for beheading. So we have different religions, so they cannot, this tiny group of fanatic organizations in this country who are dominating through Sharia councils and exhibiting themselves through burqas and veils cannot claim to be our representatives. But some of the young people, of course, in the Kurdish community have been radicalized in this country by going to mosque. They were actually brainwashed and driven into some sort of jihadi ideas. So I know some families who complained about that. So in my opinion, even the mosques are not a place for practicing, your religion. It has become a place for spreading hatred and hate preaches. There's a huge misunderstanding in this country. Islamic medievalist views have been brought back to life by Islamist extremists and seem to have become the norm. So every Muslim have been kind of put into that box. For example, there's a view that all people who come from the so-called Muslim background are devout Muslims who need a mosque, a Sharia court, and Islamic schools. This is for women to be wrapped up in burqa and veil. I myself, I have faced that so many times. They are shocked I'm not in veil or I'm not under burqa. or I'm not going in burkini to the beach, for example. This is the most racist, divisive view and is reductionist approach to women that turns women into bodies that cannot be imagined outside of black burqas and veils. It's a deliberate undermining of their real agency. This view exists because of a couple of reasons. Let me explain a little bit. Over the last few years, a new tendency towards the choice of wearing the veil or burqa, and recently burkini, or calling for marriage and divorce in Sharia councils, in my opinion, are part and parcels of the rhetoric of women having choice, Muslim women having choice, with Muslim women having agency, or as a counter reaction to Western feminism, has become an obsession for some academics, journalists, and leftists who both promote and defend it as an identity or authentic identity and choice for Muslim women. They make the excuse that these women have choice over their body. They can wear whatever they want under the pretext of freedom of dress, which was once a feminist demand in the West. In addition, they claim that covering a woman's body is an act against Western consumerism and objectification of women as naked bodies, and so on. So as if burqa and veil, forcing them on 5-year-old girls, is not sexual objectification, but a liberation and agency. Such confusing and misrepresentation of rights, agency, and choice is part and parcel of the Islamist ideology, which is manifesting itself back in the days through Al-Qaeda and today through ISIS and Boko Haram and their imagination and representation of female body. In my view, there's a link between this rise of calling for burqa and burkini and veil and Sharia councils and the September 11th, when Al-Qaeda was at its peak, and it was seen to be an anti-imperialist force. And some of the left, of course, in this country falling into that trap of supporting this kind of so-called revolutionaries. We saw a rise of jihadis in the West. The public space was more than ever subjected to Islamification through women wearing burqas and men with shaved mustaches and long beards. More than ever, the so-called community leaders and mosque preachers spoke out against anything Western, preaching hate and calling for jihad. Basically, the whole burqa thing, it might be a choice for some, but it is only a political choice. It cannot be a personal choice, in my opinion. And it supports and it's a banner for political Islam in this country. When I come to this country 20 years ago, there were not so many burqa revolutionaries around. I could see women wearing veils, but it was less politically loaded. However, today's politicization of the burqa, the veil, the burkini, and Sharia councils as a woman's choice are new configurations of Islamism on a global level. The whole choice and agency rhetoric among some radicalized ethnic minority is a reduction of Muslim women's varied problems in terms of domestic violence, unemployment, lack of integration, and so on. So many major problems, somehow turning them into a problem of so-called choice over a burqa or a veil or a divorce and marriage in Sharia councils. The whole homogenization of Muslim women as a devout and supportive person of a burqa and the Sharia law is false and reductionist. We do not accept it. There is a clear line and huge difference between ordinary Muslims who are in the first place the first victims of Islamization and Islamic terrorism, like in Syria and Iraq and many other places that we are witnessing today. In fact, they are only reinforcing oppression. They are part of a male-dominated jihadi ideology that only wants women to be the property of men, to be sex slaves, to be virgins in heaven, or even worse, as jihadi rights. The core issue here that we have to uphold is human rights, children's rights, and women's rights, to claim justice and equality, not religious or cultural beliefs and norms that are discriminative. I am not sure how in a European country Sharia councils are allowed. How can a divorce and marriage be conducted according to laws set 1,400 years ago, under which a man can divorce a woman by saying, I divorce you 3 times, while the woman through go hell if she wants to divorce, as my other colleagues earlier spoke about it. I ask, where is equality in this? How has the concept of equality become so degraded when it comes to the plight of women who are not from a white Western background? How comes equality means difference in the treatment of women and subjecting them to horrors of Sharia law? The rhetoric that Muslim women choose to go to Sharia councils for divorce and marriage is nonsense in my opinion. This is just half of the story. If these women do not go to Sharia council to get married or divorced, they will be looked at differently, treated with less respect and face bullying. This is the horrific theater of Islamic divorce and marriage. Islamic extremist women who are used to showcase this Islamic version of choice and agency, and that Sharia councils are the same, of course. The fact that women are choosing to go through this humiliation is nonsense. Women do not have choice. There is an entire social and religious expectation and sets of demands in this. Often women cannot find the courage to oppose it because of the consequences they will face. Domestic violence, stigma, and shame. Therefore, I call for banning of all forms of religious arbitration that are there, and should be one standard and one law for all. That all religions are man-made, in my opinion. Therefore, they are patriarchal. They cannot deliver justice. They cannot deliver equality in their treatment of women. And my final note, again, we have to learn from the struggle of women of Kobani and Rojava. When they won the fight against ISIS, the first thing they rejected was the marriage and divorce in an Islamic way. So therefore they have a civil court, they have a secular constitution at the moment. And as a Kurdish woman, I'm proud of that. And I think we should follow that path, and we have to call for the abolition of Sharia law entirely in this country. And for all these mosques and religious centers who are spreading this whole structures of women being treated as inferior and second-class citizens in Europe must come under fire and must come under investigation and basically to close down. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Razan. And there is shortage of the time, and then let's move to another speakers. And our next speaker is Yasmin Rahman. And Yasmin Rahman is a human rights activist and researcher. She is currently working with Women's Resource Center as coordinator of the Panland Violence Against Women and Girls Consortium. Prior to this, Yasmin worked with a number of women's organizations, including Welsh Women's Aid, providing training for equalities, diversity, and inclusion for higher education institutions, and an independent panel member reviewing past serious case reviews. And Yasmin Rahman will speak on a topic of women's world.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening, and thanks for being here on this cold November night. At this time of night, some of us would like to be at home. The title of my presentation was A Woman's Worth, but I think it could also be It's Time we had a discussion about marriage. And we know feminists who've come before me have often talked about marriage, and there's been huge debates, certainly when I was a child. But I think a discussion about Islam and about marriage is way, way overdue. Fawzia Ahmed, who is a researcher who's writing this series on Muslim women in Britain, said that British Muslims are facing what she describes as a relationship crisis, and that getting married and staying married is one of the biggest contemporary issues facing Muslim diasporas. Yet it is an issue that many mosques, Muslim organisations, secular, legal and welfare services are failing to offer adequate support for. So where does she think the adequate support is going to come from? Does she think it's going to come from Sharia courts? We now have two inquiries. We've got the so-called independent inquiry into Sharia councils, headed by Professor Mona Siddiqui, and we have the Home Affairs Select Committee, which is investigating Sharia courts as well, and their practices. And it's been really interesting sort of reading through some of the submissions and watching the coverage from last week, and Mariam's already talked about some of it. A lot of the focus is on divorce. It's about how does a Muslim woman get a colour? How does a Muslim woman seek a path that would help her exit an abusive relationship or a relationship that she simply no longer wants to be part of. I think we need to take a step back and actually look at the marriage practices that are taking place within Muslim communities. As my fellow panellists have already said, those of us from Muslim backgrounds often do not recognise the way that our faith is being practiced. I do not recognise the Islam that many of my fellow Muslims adhere to anymore. Things that were not Sunni practice are now, but were considered Shia practice, like temporary marriage, are now acceptable. And that, I think, is part of the Islamic project that we spoke about earlier. It's how this imposition of one Sharia, there is not one Sharia, there are 6 schools of Sharia law. How practices from one school of thought are then being imposed on everyone as the true and authentic version of Islam. Polygamy has always been an issue. It's always been an issue for Muslim women, but and I've been studying polygamy now for 6 years, but when I've spoken to Islamic scholars and theologians who came across in the 50s and the 60s with that first wave of immigrants along with my parents, they have all without exception said to me, we thought polygamy would die out. As more and more generations were born here, we just thought that it was a practice that would go away. And yet we seem to be seeing the opposite. That now when marriages are being negotiated between young men and young women are very openly saying to young women, if you want to marry me, you must know you will not be my only wife. So he's stating at the outset that he will be denying this woman the protection of the state, the protection of the civil law, the protections that generations before of us fought really hard for. And yet, if you look at the discussions at the Home Affairs Select Committee, they seem to have a resolution that, well, if we don't have religious marriages, we have every marriage registered, then that will be an end to it. And we have women on the committees, and then they can get divorced really easily. It's not as simple as that. It really isn't as simple as that. One, we don't know the numbers for polygamous marriages. How do you know? How do you define a polygamous marriage? How do you know when it becomes polygamous? If the man in question hasn't told any number of his wives that he's taken another, that they're in separate households, that there is no connection between them. It was really interesting that I've now interviewed almost 100 people. There were 2 women that I interviewed, and I also interviewed a woman who runs a Muslim women's organisation. She said that one day in the waiting room there were 2 women sitting waiting to be seen and obviously discussing their experiences with each other. And they realised that they were married to the same man. And all hell broke loose, as you can imagine. How would you be able to pick that up in numbers, in that call for empirical evidence? You only know if you're in a multiple marriage situation if somebody has disclosed that fact to you. Temporary marriages, through my work on forced marriage, so many young women who, in order to avoid committing zina, because the issue is about sex and controlling women's sexuality, have entered into secret nikahs, so just had a religious marriage. She's had a final time, he's had a final time with her, they've probably gone their separate ways, not thought about getting an Islamic divorce, and then it becomes an issue when the young woman decides that she does want to marry again. She potentially will have 2 nikahs running simultaneously. She can't disclose to her family that she's had a secret nikah because she's then at huge risk of honour-based violence. And with that, we know the data in terms of murder. We know the data in terms of women disappearing. What does she do? He's happily gone along on his merry way because he can have as many nikahs as he chooses to have. And this thing about limiting it to 4, it's a revolving door. 4 at any one time. As a Muslim woman, I have huge issues with religious practices within my faith. And when we have discussions within the community about early marriage, child marriage, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, honour-based violence, the Sharia councils and courts or religious leaders will stand up and say again and again and again, but that's culture. That's culture, nothing to do with Islam, nothing to do with religion, that's culture. If we could just separate religion and culture, we could all get back to this authentic Islam, then everything would be okay. That doesn't work for temporary marriage. It doesn't work for polygamous marriage. The Prophet himself, peace be upon him, married 11 times. The Quran states that a man can marry more than one wife. Temporary marriage is in Islamic doctrine. How do you then get away from that? Things that, my generation knew nothing about temporary marriage, someone coming from a Sunni background, it was something that Shias did, and it was definitely something that Sunnis didn't do, and I did find out about it.
What they do in Saudi,
Sorry?
They do similar one in Saudi and in the Arab world, it's
yes, when you're travelling.
With a little bit difference.
But I'm meeting more and more and more people who are entering into these marriages, and it's not just young people. Women in their 30s and 40s who may be divorced, who have got children, who want to have a sexual life that is accepted in terms of their religious beliefs, are becoming no more than mistresses. One woman I spoke to said, I get to keep my children, I get to keep my house, he turns up for 2 nights a week, and then he goes away. Is that marriage? It's certainly not my understanding of marriage. On the one hand, you've got religious leaders talking about the sanctity of the institution. I've never known marriage to be a spiritual act. In Islam it was always a contract, but now suddenly it's become half of faith, is what we're told. But where is the sanctity of a relationship that A, you're not prepared to make a public declaration of, and B, that you're not prepared to make a real commitment, that you'll only enter into religious marriage and you'll test the waters to see how it goes, and then if it's okay and you're feeling a bit more comfortable, then we'll have a civil marriage and run the risk of, if it does go bad, then maybe losing some property and some finance. It is hugely challenging, and I think there are some really, really difficult debates ahead of us. And this is not something that is just being raised by secular Muslims like myself or people of various degrees of faith or no faith. There are organisations in Muslim-majority countries across the world who, at great personal risk, are standing up against the imposition by Islamist jihadi movements of controlling women and children through all of these marriage practices. So the reduction in the age at which young women get married, so it's puberty. Puberty happens much, much sooner now than it once did. Sisters in Islam, for example. You've had their offices closed, you've had their internets closed, you've had a huge personal cost. We've heard a little bit about the movements in India and the triple talaq. And women sort of standing up against that. Women in Canada, the Canadian Council of Muslim Women, who have stood up and said, no, we don't want Sharia here, there is no place for it. And on the other hand, you've got people like Khatam al-Halal, who, a well-known religious preacher, who positively advocates polygamy. When it comes to marriage practices, there is no get-out clause in terms of the culture issue. This is clearly in the religion that I adhere and I follow. But the conversation is way, way, way overdue. And there's also the issue of harms. We've talked, Sabine has spoken about the harms at the Sharia courts, but the harms are occurring much, much sooner. It's there in the negotiating process of a marriage. A man only becomes fiscally responsible for his wife post-consummation of the marriage. So it's basically trading safety for sexual services. That, again, does not sound like marriage to me. It's certainly not my understanding of it. There is no equality if we're talking about multiple marriage. As Nawal al-Sadali says, if a man marries 4 wives, even if he treats them equally, it still means that each woman among them has only a quarter of a man, whereas the man has 4 women. The women here are only equal in the sense that they suffer an equal injustice. This can in no way be considered equality or justice or rights for women. Just focusing on Sharia courts and making it easier for women to get an Islamic divorce is not going to protect the rights of women and children in Muslim communities, but it's not just about Muslim communities either. Think about converts, think about people who end up in interfaith marriages and what can happen there and how Sharia can be exploited, sometimes by the non-Muslim party, as Father may go on to speak about. We're going to have some very, very difficult discussions ahead of us, and they will be fraught with tensions, but that does not mean that we shy away from them. There is far, far too much at stake. There is the safety of all of us, but there are the lives of women and children across this land that we have to stand up for and give voice to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. Yeah, let's move. Our another next speaker is Gina Khan. And Gina is here. Yeah. Gina Khan was born in Birmingham to Pakistani Muslim parents. Gina is a human rights activist and researcher. Personal experiences prompted Gina to break her silence in 2005 by speaking out in radio debates and writing to local Birmingham newspapers following a traumatic divorce and experience of living as a lone woman and parent in Birmingham. You can start, Gina.
I'm going to just take off from where Yasmin was talking about polygamy, because I collected a witness testimony this week, and it sort of shook me to the core as well when I was taking it down. So I'm going to read parts of it out to you, not too much of it, it's too long. And I'll wear my glasses as well, and usually I don't, so. Right. This is from Habiba Jan. I'm a British-born Pakistani Muslim woman in my 40s. I became a women's rights activist after my own life experiences had impacted me. I founded the Auric Foundation and authored a report. I did a research on the status of British Muslim women in regards to the practice of polygamy and discrimination they face. She did that through, it was put into evidence on the National Secular Society, if you want to find it. I can give anybody details if they want to read a report. However, this is her testimony. I was a victim of Islamic practice of polygamy. It impacted my life because my mother was a victim of polygamy. My father was a British citizen who was a driving instructor. He made friends with my mum's family, settled in the UK, and subsequently went to Pakistan, Karachi, in the early 70s to marry my mother. She came here 7 months pregnant with the first child on a spouse visa, lived in a nice area in Birmingham. After the birth of my sister, I was born, and my father rejected me because he didn't want another daughter. He made it clear he didn't want another daughter. I was told by my uncle that my dad had thrown my mum out with me in her arms. I was a newborn baby, and my uncle had to go and pick us up. We were stranded in the rain. She had nowhere to go. The family also discovered he had another wife, which was not acceptable to them. My uncles, our family, did not believe in this practice, and we're talking 1970s here. We did not believe in this